All right. Now here's a fellow, Titus Flavius. Flavius from the name of his grandfather. The Flavian dynasty is the one that we begin under Vespasian, and Vespasianus as a result of his father, taking on the name of his father. What in the world does this guy have to do with the New Testament? His name is not mentioned even once. Well, let's talk about his background a little bit. He was born in Rome in 39. So put this in perspective with when Jesus died, somewhere around 30, 33-ish, okay? And so this is at the end of the apostolic age. The Apostle Paul, toward the end of the apostolic age, the Apostle Paul will die in 65-ish, okay? So right about in the middle he was born, but of course he will come to adulthood and come to prominence at the end of the life of the Apostle Paul, near the end of it. He is the eldest son of Vespasian and Domitiana, I'll call her Domitiana, I don't know how this should be pronounced, Major, or the elder. She's the older Domitiana because her daughter will be Domitiana Minor or Domitiana the younger. And does that name Domitiana have a familiar ring to it? How about Emperor Domitian? Okay, so his younger brother, Titus Flavius Domitianus, born in 51, is commonly called Domitian. So he was succeeded after his death by his younger brother. And Domitian is famous for what?
Persecution Christians.
Okay, that's right. That's something to really great to be known for. He was raised in the imperial court, and Bruce mentioned this earlier, with Britannicus, who was the son of Claudius, who was murdered by Nero, because anyone who was in the royal line who stood perhaps to take over Nero's throne would be put to death by Nero, and he was one of them. Britannicus was one of them. He showed, Titus that is, showed an early promise in the military arts and was a skilled poet and orator both in Greek and Latin. So apparently clever and capable, and also not just capable in terms of his mental acuity, but also in terms of his military capability. In his early adulthood, Titus gained renown as a military commander. In 57 to 59, he was made military tribune in Germania, and that's about where it sounds like it is, the area that's now Germany. He also served in Britannia, which is also about where you would expect it to be, in the area of Britain. In about 63, he returned to Rome and married Aricinia Tertulla, who died in about 65. So very short-lived marriage because she was a short-lived woman. And then he had an arranged marriage with Marcia Furnilla. She came from a distinguished family, but her family denounced Nero. And so for political reasons, he divorced her shortly after he married her, and he never married again after that. So all of his marriages came early in his life. I want to introduce another character here whose name has come up quite a bit throughout these classes. Flavius Josephus. Now notice that name Flavius again after the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and Titus. So he took on this name at a later time. He was born Yosef ben Matityahu. Say that 3 times real fast. So he's a Jew, and he is also a Jewish Roman historian. Most of what we know about this period of time comes primarily from him, although there were 6 other historians who were operating at this time whose works we still either have or have been preserved for us by the works of other people. So they were quoted by other people, and even if we don't have the primary work, we have what was said about their work. His work called War of the Jews covered this war that we're about to talk about in a fair amount of detail. He was the commander of the Jewish army in Galilee. The Romans invaded Galilee in 67 under Vespasian. He wasn't the commander in that skirmish, but there was a 47-day siege placed around the Jewish city that was the center of that conquest, and there were several group suicides inside the city, and at the end of the skirmish there were 40, I guess you'd call that more than a skirmish, wouldn't you? 40,000 dead as a result of the siege. Josephus, the commander of the army, surrendered to Vespasian and became prisoner of Rome. He claimed then to receive a divine revelation that Vespasian would become emperor, which then, of course, actually happened. In 69, when the prophecy was fulfilled, Josephus was released and assumed the family name Flavius. So he's getting as close as he can to the Roman leadership. He was useful in negotiating with the Jews in Jerusalem during the siege. Titus actually made use of Josephus as a translator, interpreter, and also as an intermediary between the Jewish nation and Rome. But by this time, Flavius Josephus was already acting as a Roman emissary, so he was loyal to Rome at this point, and continued to serve as advisor to Titus. At a later time, Josephus would write about himself that he was a Roman informant from the beginning. Now, of course, when you're trying to garner favor from the Romans, you don't know whether that statement is true or whether he's just trying to make himself look good in retrospect. But he was a close advisor to Titus for the rest of his life. And he's a contemporary with Titus. He wrote his history with Roman patronage. So he went back and with the favor of the Roman governor, he lived there in the palace complex at times and stayed close to Titus and had the support of Titus as he wrote his histories. So let's talk then about the first Jewish-Roman war. And the reason I'm just going to plow through this is because I don't know there's a lot here to discuss immediately. I'll give a chance for that at the end, but I also said I wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for you all to talk about whatever you wanted to talk about this morning, since this is our last class together. In 66, the Jews revolted against the Roman government. Cestius Gallus, the legate of Syria, was defeated at Beth Horon. So you've got a Roman legate with a powerful army who is being defeated by the Jews. This is no minor affair. The Jews are serious about this, and they're ready to go to war. So he retreated from Jerusalem. Well, that can't stand. King Agrippa II, where do we remember him from? Who did he try? Paul, that's right. Paul stood before Agrippa II and his sister, who is either called Bernice or Berenice, depending on which source you read from. I prefer the name Berenice because Bernice is a name that we're all familiar with, and it tends to make her disappear. This is a very popular name throughout the empire and has remained a popular name throughout virtually every country to this time. Its Greek form is Berenike. Berenike, what does that sound like? It sounds like the shoes, doesn't it? Nikes. Well, why are Nikes called Nikes? Nike means victory. Nike was the Greek god of victory. So it's a victorious name. Okay? They were pro-Roman also, and they served under the authority of Rome, so they fled to Galilee and surrendered to Rome. And then Nero dispatched Vespasian with 2 legions, 40,000 soldiers, to Jerusalem. Vespasian was joined by his son Titus at Ptolemais with another legion, now 60,000 strong. The Romans swept across Galilee to march on Jerusalem. And Titus at this time was proving himself as a very capable general. which will become necessary. The campaign came to a brief halt with the death of Nero in 68. And of course, Vespasian eventually is going to go to Rome. But that begins with this year of 4 emperors at the death of Nero. I think this has been mentioned before in this class. There was a year in which there were 4 consecutive emperors quickly. Titus was sent from Judea to greet Galba, who was claiming the throne. And of course, he wants to pay homage to Galba, but by the time he gets there, Galba had already been assassinated and was replaced by Otho by the time he arrived. Vitellius and his armies were preparing to march on Rome to overthrow Otho. And Titus returned to Judea to stay out of the way of that. We'll see how this is settled, and then I'll go pay homage to whoever's in control. Well, Otho was defeated and committed suicide. And then the legions in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria at this time is a very important center in the Roman Empire. A lot of the Roman Empire was in its surrounds. And so the legions in Alexandria backed Vespasian and told him he should be emperor rather than Vitellius. Well, with the support from the eastern provinces and having had this prophecy from Josephus, Vespasian marched on Rome. Titus then was left behind in charge of putting down the Jewish rebellion. So here's Vespasian's forces going to Rome, defeating Vitellius, and Vespasian was declared emperor in 69. So now the war in Judea turns to Titus, the general. In 70, he besieged Jerusalem, surrounding it with 3 legions. So again, we're talking about 60,000 soldiers around the city. He allowed pilgrims to come into the city for Passover and then refused to let them leave. This, as you can imagine, placed a heavy burden on the resources that they had inside the city. So if you're already starved for food and water, and now you have all these pilgrims, nobody knows exactly how many, coming in from all over the Roman Empire into Jerusalem, now you've got the city packed full, and you've got no food and no water. Brutal, but clever. The Jewish raids harassed the Roman army. They weren't giving up easily, and there were Jewish factions within the city and in the surrounding areas as well. So the Jews, to some extent, are fighting for power among themselves. At the same time, they were carrying out raids against the Romans. This is one time at which the assassins, the Sicarii, were fighting against the Zealots, both of whom had similar interests in Jerusalem, but now that there was power at stake, they began to turn against each other. One of the raids nearly resulted in Titus being captured. Josephus tried to negotiate a surrender. The city, but since that failed, the Jews weren't having it. The city walls were breached. There were 3 walls around the city. A relatively strong first and second wall and a relatively weak inner third wall. Titus ordered the Jewish deserters to be crucified around the walls of the city as an intimidation tactic. That would work. With the Jews exhausted by famine, the weak third wall was breached, resulting in bitter street fighting. So the Roman army has entered the city. The Romans began a frontal assault on the gates of the temple itself. So they're well inside the upper city now. As they breached the gates, they set the entire city on fire. Both the upper city and the lower city were set on fire. The temple was reduced to a plowed field. Titus gave the order to destroy the remainder of the city. They took all the rocks and threw them down onto the outer, what had been the outer wall, and left just a pile of rubble with the entire city looking like a plowed field. They left only some spires around the city so people who were coming in would note that there had been a city there at one time, because without that you wouldn't have known. Much of the population was killed or dispersed. Josephus said that 1.1 million people were killed, and that's a disputed number because that would be about the number you'd expect to be living all over the empire, all over the province. But I think it's not quite so easy to dismiss that number if you realize that all of the Jews from all the provinces had come there on a pilgrimage and were not allowed to leave. So I don't know how many were there. It was a lot. At least 93,000 by two different sources were captured or enslaved. 93,000. You want to know where the Romans got all their slaves inside the city to serve their people? Most of them had been taken by war. Jews fled everywhere in the empire. A great many of them went to the Decapolis, which is on the other side of Jordan River, up around the Sea of Galilee. On return to Rome in 71, Titus was awarded a triumph. In Roman jargon, a triumph was a huge, what we would call a ticker tape parade, where he's been received by the populace with a wreath placed upon his head. And in honor of his conquest, the Arch of Titus was built, and that arch is still standing. He refused a wreath of victory because he claimed that he had been a vehicle through which their God had manifested his wrath against his people.
Jarrell, how do you know that? That's pretty...
Well, and again, you have to remember that a lot of this is coming from the historians of the time who were beholden to Rome. So you have to ask yourself, first of all, is it true? If it was recorded by Josephus, that's exactly the kind of thing that Josephus would say in order to maintain favor with Rome. Okay, so you don't have to take blame for having killed all these people. It was God who did this.
And we know it was.
You're an instrument of the gods, right? So
Well,
he would have liked that.
well, I mean, we know it.
Yeah, well.
We know it now, but...
So Titus is made the prefect of the Praetorian Guard under his father. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard is the highest ranking guardsman under his father. And he took his job very seriously because he ordered many executions for purported conspiracy against his dad. And part of this was to show loyalty to his father, because you certainly don't want to be a son showing yourself in any way disloyal to the Caesar. That has gotten a lot of sons killed. Okay, now a little interesting historical side note, but does have to do with it does touch on Scripture a bit, doesn't it? Because we know about Berenice. Titus had an affair with her that had actually begun during the Jewish-Roman War. Berenice was a Herodian who had collaborated with the Romans during the rebellion, along with her brother. She had a love affair with Titus during the Jewish wars. While the wars were going on, and after she and her brother had surrendered to Rome, she began an affair with Titus. Notice how a lot of these stories of the women have to do with trying to establish themselves and their children in close connection with the greatest, most successful leaders for their survival as much as anything else, and for the survival and advancement of their family members. So, you know, we might have a tendency to look askance at some of these people who are really just trying to keep their scalps and to try to maintain some connection with royalty so that they wouldn't be killed. So they had supported Vespasian in his campaign to become emperor. And in 75, she went to Rome and lived with Titus in the palace. 5 years after the conquest of Jerusalem. The Romans were wary of her, and she was denounced by Cynic philosophers. And Cynic doesn't just mean cynical. This was a school of philosophy is very common in, very prominent in Rome at this time. And Titus sent her away under the pressure that ensued, but his reputation had already been irreparably damaged by having her live in the palace with him. An Eastern princess living in the Roman palace wasn't good for politics. By all accounts, while she lived in the palace, she enjoyed all of the privileges and power of a queen. There was one account where she had even been on trial for some crime by the Senate, and she was appointed as the judge in her own trial. That pretty much assures the outcome. All right, so Titus then as Caesar. Vespasian died of an infection in 79. One of the rare emperors who wasn't poisoned. Upon his death, Titus became the first Roman emperor to succeed his biological father. I don't know if you've realized it all this time or not, but since all of the children of the emperors were being killed, in order to protect the throne, oftentimes they would end up selecting a nephew or a grandson or someone like that to succeed them. This is the first time, after all this, so far this succession of emperors, the first time that a son actually succeeded his father. So apparently Titus did a pretty good job of proving to his father that he was loyal to him. Despite the concerns over his character, he ruled to great acclaim and was favored by contemporary historians. Apparently he was a fairly good administrator. Unlike Nero, he was eventually found to be a man of virtue in the Roman definition of the word, rather than a man of vice. He was best known for completing the Colosseum, his generosity in relieving the suffering caused by two disasters. Anybody know what famous disaster occurred during the rule of Titus? Yes, that's right. The great volcano that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum, Mount Vesuvius, erupted in 79. And according to historians, he actually opened up his palace and let the survivors from the eruption and from the fire occupy it for a period of time until they could find homes. So there was another fire, not the fire of the Great Fire under Nero, but a lesser fire, but still very destructive in Rome in 80. And it was during that time that Titus proved himself very generous and open-handed. After barely 2 years in office, Titus died of a fever in 81. He was deified by the Roman Senate and succeeded by his younger brother Domitian. Where does Titus, what do you know about Titus from the Bible? I already hinted that he's not there. He's not in there by name. What do you know about him from the Bible?
Does he show up in some of the prophecies of the fall of Jerusalem?
Exactly. Jesus spoke indirectly, and many people believe that Jesus' quotation from Daniel of the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not is actually a reference to Titus. But it's certainly a reference to something having to do with Rome. The appearance of paganism in the temple or in Jerusalem and its surrounds. Okay, so in Acts chapter 25, verses 13 and 23, and chapter 26 and verse 30. Let's take a quick look at Acts 25 and see what it says. verse 13, Paul is standing before Agrippa and Berenice. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice, if you will, arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So this is a reference to his eventual lover, and she will show up again in verse 23 and again in chapter 26 and verse 30. So Paul stood not only before Agrippa, but also before Agrippa's sister, and his sister also seemed to have wielded at least almost equal power to Agrippa. And so when you would appear before one, you would appear before the other. And there were many who rumored that they were having an incestuous affair. And because of rumors to that effect, she was actually given a formal marriage to another man for a period of time, which was short-lived, and then she came back to the palace of her brother. But it was after this time during which she was accused of having an affair that she went away and had an affair with Titus. Complicated. Okay, so what Brett was referencing, the New Testament prophecies of Jesus regarding the destruction of Jerusalem take place in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 21, especially in verses 20 and 21. These are passages that are controversial because they have to do with not only the destruction of Jerusalem, but many questions swirl around what else they have to do with besides the destruction of Jerusalem. Do they also point to a future time? You know, these are passages that are often cited in regards to the second coming of Christ. The controversy centers around whether the second coming of Christ was at the destruction of Jerusalem, whether that was the second coming of Christ, or whether we await another coming yet. And if we wait another coming yet, as the scriptures seem to indicate, is Matthew chapter 24 indicating that, or is Matthew chapter 24 only talking about the destruction of Jerusalem? Complicated, but interpretation of prophecy often is complicated, and sometimes the biggest mistakes that we can make is to think we know more than we actually do. Read those passages for yourself. Read Matthew 24 and tell me, at what point does it stop talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and tell me exactly where it starts talking about another coming of Christ apart from the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not as easy as you might think. And if you're convinced that perhaps it talks about both, when is it talking about another coming of Christ yet to come? Again, we tend to oversimplify things, but if you read through these scriptures, you'll see it may not be quite as easy to answer those questions as we tend to have, I think, typically suggested by our summary explanations of those verses. The book of Hebrews is thought by many to be occurring right before the destruction of Jerusalem. And there are several passages that I've listed here in Hebrews that seem to be references to an impending destruction. In chapter 10, verses 25 to 27, he speaks specifically of a day that is to come. And again, the question is, what day is he talking about? Is he talking about a day of destruction, or is he talking about a day when the Lord returns again? And much of the book of Revelation is a topic of controversy. So these are all, apart from the passages mentioned in Acts, they're all books that could be regarded as books of prophecy. And the question is exactly what is and what is not being prophesied there. It's not my intention to get into that quagmire because we need another trimester to sort it out. But if you have questions regarding anything about Titus or any comments that you'd like to make about him, yes, Bruce.
When the Jews first revolted in 66, what did that revolt look like? Did they just pay taxes? Did they storm on outposts?
Riots.
I don't really know how they revolted.
Yeah, there were some pretty severe riots that were taking place. And of course, Rome doesn't like riots, so they'd send out, their centurions to try to put it down, and some of them are now being assassinated. And then there was this rebellion where the rebellion became so severe that the legate at Syria sent an army to try to put it down, and his army was defeated. So obviously this had become more than just a minor affair. There were people were dying, and Romans were dying in the streets, and Roman sympathizers were dying. Yes, sir.
In reading about this, the uprising that all started in '66, I've read that the Zealots were one of the main groups, and they had actually, I guess you'd say, guerrilla warfare, and the Roman garrisons were stationed all over. There's like 15, 20 people. Well, they'd go in and eliminate those groups all over, and that's what got the Roman army's attention so much that they came in, because of what the Zealots were doing during that period of time.
Yes. Yeah,
They
I
were
read that.
definitely against being occupied in Jerusalem.
That's a better summary than what I gave, but yes, you're right. There were organized hits on Roman garrisons at the same time. Mary?
When did that siege start? Did you tell me, did you have a slide that said how many thousands of Roman soldiers encircled the city?
Yeah, 60,000 Roman soldiers encircled the city in 70.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't go in if I saw that many soldiers.
Yeah.
And then one of those verses you just showed us in Luke, I mean, yeah. said, don't do-
Maybe there were people who did see the city surrounded and decided not to go in, but if you're a Roman and you're coming from other parts of the province, even if you're Jewish, maybe you don't necessarily think seeing the Roman army there is a bad thing. I don't know. That's a lot of soldiers, isn't it? Yes, sir.
I think another thing that I don't hear discussed much, but you take the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and that was the center of the Jewish religion. Well, it actually got started back during the wilderness where Moses wrote the Pentateuch and set that system of religion up for the Jews. And of course, there were oral traditions also added to that later on. But God had to wipe that whole thing out in order to change from the Judaism to the spiritual kingdom that he's got now, I think. What do you think about that? And he had to, in other words, the temple was supposed to, it had to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Certainly, it's noteworthy that temple stood from the time that it was rebuilt when they came back from Babylon all the way up until the time that Jesus did his work on earth, and then 40 years later it was eliminated.
And another thing, it can't be rebuilt because of what's sitting there today.
Well, that would be a
God
difficult
saw that all
problem,
that was
wouldn't
put
it?
in place to keep that from being rebuilt. And I believe that had the temple, the Muslim temple not been put on that temple mount, that they would, at some point, the Jews would have put a temple back there.
And there are many premillennialists that believe that still has to happen.
Right.
So this is the center of a lot of religious controversy right from the start. Yes, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember all the details, but, and I think God's hand was in this too, that there are many provocations. The Roman governors were generally not very good. Even these names of Festus, Felix, and then Alpinus, that they were really, in many ways, again, I forgot the details, but revoking, there were these groups like the Zealots that were always stirring the pot, but there were particular things they did that really got things boiling much more, and in many ways caused the rebellion. There were other Jewish leaders that said, hey, let's realize who we're coming up against. Let's not take it that far. you had mentioned in here almost, 20-something years before, there had been on the brink of this when Caligula was determined to put a Roman statue in the temple.
He was going to put a statue of himself in the
Right,
temple.
the Syrian governor kept trying to put that off, and finally Caligula died. But yeah, it's a very tumultuous period.
Yeah. And there were constantly riots in Rome that were being put down locally, but this one had just reached a boiling point and had just gotten to the point where it couldn't be handled locally, and that's why outsiders had to come in to try to put it down. This is all a fascinating history, and to now go back and read what Josephus wrote about it would be, if you're into history, this would be a great time to do that if you haven't done it before.
It is interesting too that this, like you said, that the numbers, there's some dispute, but maybe if the 1 million, maybe 4 million people in this area, that's smaller, much smaller than Kentucky. 1 out of every 4 people killed, and people killed in many other cities, as this broke out, the Greco-Roman populations in cities like Caesarea and Alexandria. There's a huge massacre of Jews in Alexandria and Caesarea. But one of the things about it, as devastating as the destruction was, the Jews eventually repopulated Jerusalem, maybe not to the same extent. And then there was really the final, in 132, I think, or around there, where they even then renamed the area.
Yeah.
They said, okay, we're not going to allow Jews back in here.
What we just covered was the first Jewish-Roman War,
Right.
which of course implies that there were others.
Rail?
Yes, sir.
There's another thing that I have understood that happened during the 1870s when the Roman garrison, the 60,000 soldiers, for a week, they pulled back from that siege around that city. And they said that the Christians there, they had revelation, they knew this was it, and all the Christians left. So there was no Christians killed during that time, according to some accounts that I've read. So that's kind of something noteworthy, I think.
This prophecy in Matthew chapter 24 stands as a great testimony to the foreknowledge of God. There are not many people who would say that prophecy in Matthew chapter 24 was written before or after the destruction of Jerusalem. Everyone regards Matthew to have been written quite early on, most everyone. Of course, you're going to find some scholars who are going to debate it, but most everyone regards Matthew to have been written quite early on in the history of Christianity. And the explicit prophecy that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and explicit instructions to Christians to what to do in preparation for the destruction. How many of you would have waited for the sign from heaven after what Jesus said? I think I would have packed up immediately. Said, let's just go ahead and get ahead of this thing. Because once you got the sign, you didn't have long. He said, it wouldn't be great if you're carrying a child or if you're nursing a child during that time. You need to get out of the city immediately. Don't go back to your house and get anything. Just go. Head for the hills. So I suspect that a great many Christians were spared from this destruction because of that prophecy. Well, so much for opening up the floor to whatever else you want to talk about. I thought we got through that faster. Okay. Surprise, surprise. Well, listen, thanks to the co-teachers. I really appreciate Bruce and Seth for all the hard work they did. This was not an easy class to teach. It required a lot of work, and appreciate the fact that they really put the time in. Thank you all for being here with us.